What is going on, guys? Hope everyone is doing great out there. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm honored that you're here. So, a few things before we get into the news this week. First, I gotta say up front, and you probably hear it right now, we are in East Tennessee right now experiencing some major thunderstorms and even, threats of a possible tornado. So, you're gonna hear lots of thunder and lightning. I guess you can't hear lightning, but there will be flashes in my room that I see, and you will hear thunder. So there's nothing I can do about that. I apologize, but I guess in this week's episode, it was meant for you to hear thunder. In fact, probably just heard some right then. So wanted to mention that to begin with. Also, just a reminder, I have timestamps throughout the episode. So if you don't want to hear about a certain country, whether it's China or Russia or whatever, or if you want to skip forward, you can do that. If you don't care about any of that stuff and you just want to get to the motivation section or to the section where we talk about Medal of Honor winners, you can do that as well. Just look at the timestamps. I put those there for your convenience so you can quickly find what you want to get to. Now, one quick administrative note from 2 weeks ago. I made one mistake that a very wise listener pointed out to me, and I didn't receive in time permission to use this person's name, but it's a 20-plus year veteran of the military who is an officer and a pretty highly ranked officer, so I'm honored to have this person listening and actually supporting the show. He's a paid subscriber, but he did mention that 2 weeks ago I shared a announcement from CENTCOM in a news bulletin about Haiti, which CENTCOM, which stands for Central Command and is mostly covering the Middle East, had shared this message about Haiti, and it was about the airlift into Haiti. And, when I recorded that, you have so many notes out, and you're jumping from subject to subject, and you're worried about everything from the time to, are you speaking clearly and loud enough to be heard on the speaker. But at the time, I thought it was a little odd that CENTCOM put that message out. But I'm like, I don't think they go over to Haiti, but who knows? Maybe it's part of they've been expanded, but I failed to research that. But I'm very thankful that this Lieutenant Colonel caught it, and he messaged me and said, hey, just so you know, Haiti is actually in Southcom, or Southern Command, and CENTCOM, or Central Command, had just shared that message. So that was a boo-boo or mistake on my part, so I apologize for getting that wrong. I definitely want to get everything as accurate and correct as possible, so I try my best not to make mistakes, and I don't think I make very many, but if you ever catch me making one, definitely reach out to me. I want to correct the record for sure. Now, one other thing I wanted to share before we get to the news is I wanted to share something one of my friends is doing because I think it might help you. And so this friend of mine is super conservative, and I, of course, have super conservative friends and super liberal friends. I somehow maintain a balanced relationship with all of them, mainly because I do not talk politics, and almost every one of them thinks I'm either super left or super right because I just basically don't disagree with people that are my friends. I try not to talk politics. But in this case, one of my super conservative friends, who also attends my church, decided about 4 weeks ago that he was going to do less Facebook and also turn off all alerts for Fox News. Basically, stop watching it so much. And so he's been doing that, and he gave us an update this past week, and we talked about how much less stressed he was and how he was more calm. And we were kind of all laughing, and I said, a lot of the cable channels and some of the talk radio, wherever podcasts, all of them, many of them, they solely seem focused on just trying to get your blood pressure up so that you will tell others about the show. And so I try to do the exact opposite of that. But as we were talking, the thought struck me that I mean, honestly, is there anyone out there, anyone, other than just a few people that don't pay any attention, but is there anyone who doesn't already know who they're going to vote for in November right now? I mean, is there anyone out there? That number is like minuscule. Everyone knows. There's nothing I could say that would change your mind on who you're voting for. And I guarantee you there's nothing you could say to me that would change my mind on who I'm voting for. And so really, from like who we're voting for in a November perspective, we could all go into comas for the next 4 or 5 months, keep up with no news, and it would not matter. We're not changing who we're voting for. And so why do we get so many alerts? Why do we get so wrapped around the axle on all of this news stuff? You can have too much. And so I thought I would just share that because I thought, that was a great, I think what my friend's doing, and I've seen the change, but it's a wise thing. Less Fox News. Or if you're on the left, less of MSNBC or whatever channel you listen to that you really use to just keep you informed, but it's, you're watching a lot of it and it's really making you angry. Let's try a little less. I think you'll be a little more happier. And of course, you can always tell your friends about this show and say, man, that guy Stan, like I listen to him and he makes me calmer. He doesn't hype things up. He always makes me a little more relaxed because that's what I want to try to do. I've been covering the news for a long time, and we all know whether it's bird flu to Y2K to whatever, most of the time the media overhypes things because they need ad dollars, they need eyeballs, and they have to scare you a little bit so you'll stay tuned through that next section. And I just think that's not good. We live in the largest, most prosperous, and safest country in the world. So why we are always so uptight is beyond me. But it's probably in large part because of the media. Now, I am a prior journalist. I guess in some ways I still am. But it's an important role. I love the protections that we have. We have to be informed. We have to be responsible citizens. It plays an important role as a check on government. It is necessary, but it is not required that you keep up with it 10, 15, or 20 hours per week and have it ruining your life. That is not necessary. You know who you're voting for in November. Nothing's going to change your mind. You don't have to be so tuned in. There you go. There's my big tip for the week. We're going to begin the news this week focusing on China. Now, I'm fully aware that a U.S. soldier was captured inside Russia, and that is pretty big news. But the reality is the threat from China is just much larger. It just looms over everything. And so I wanted to ease into this topic this week by sharing just a short interview from an analyst who just finished a book on China, in fact, but he talks about how he expects China to potentially invade by 2028, which of course reinforces what U.S. intelligence estimates are saying, and he explains why that might be the case, and just as importantly, he explains why China is losing incentive to not invade Taiwan, since investment from U.S. and European countries is starting to dwindle greatly year by year, which longtime listeners of the show know that I've always talked about that hopefully for economic reasons, China avoids taking a path that none of us want to see them do. But I'm going to share an interview, or a brief part of an interview that Andrea Mitchell did on MSNBC with this author who just finished a book. He's a national security analyst. He just finished a book called World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. And I want you to hear what he says about the situation. And then after that, she's as part of that interview, she does a very short segment with retired Admiral Stavridis, which is also very good. So take a listen to this. It's just a few minutes long. I think you'll get a lot from it.
TikTok is now suing the U.S. government to block a potential ban if the Chinese-owned social media giant does not sell off its ownership. Experts say that TikTok poses a grave risk to national security, possibly giving China a platform to even interfere in this fall's presidential election as tensions between the two nations continue to grow. And here with me to discuss all of this is our two experts, but first, Dmitry Alperovitch, chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator, a national security think tank, and a friend, but I'm talking too quickly. He is the co-author of the new book, World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century, a terrific read. And also with us, NBC News chief international analyst, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, Admiral James Stavridis. So, Dmitry, first to you. You say that China is likely to invade before 2028. Now, the CIA has been saying within the next 5 years, so that's essentially the same assessment. What can be done to stop that? Are we doing the right things with the administration trying to bring together allies in new and creative ways in the South Pacific?
Yeah, great question, Andrew. I think the danger zone was really 2028 through 2032. She's going to be 79 and 32, may not win the re-election. He wants to accomplish this on his own watch. And we have to do everything in our power to deter this conflict. A war with China would be disastrous, of course, in lives lost, but also to the global economy, perhaps as much as $10 trillion wiped out. And we have to use both military measures and economic measures to extract as much leverage over China as possible to deter them from going after Taiwan.
The administration has tried so hard to reestablish relations after the real blow-up over the balloon, no pun intended, 2 years ago. So what do you, or a year ago, excuse me, how do you see this going? Because Secretary Blinken was just in China the week before last, didn't get a whole lot of pickup on his complaints that without China and North Korea helping Russia in Ukraine, not crossing a red American line by delivering weapons, but money, all kinds of dual-use components. Without China, Russia would not be pushing back as effectively as it is against Ukraine because of Ukraine not having months and months of U.S. weaponry.
Well, we have so many problems, certainly support for Russia, but also fentanyl, of course, the devastation in this country, but also overcapacity that the U.S. government is complaining about, dumping Chinese products in our markets, trying to destroy our economic advantage. And the reality is the Chinese are not playing ball on any of these fronts. And he got a very frosty relations reception, Secretary Blinken, in Beijing. And I think this rapprochement that started last year is coming to an end because China realizes foreign direct investment is not coming back to the country. U.S. companies are pulling out more and more. It's down 20% year over year. And I think they're asking, frankly, rightly, what's in it for us?
And Admiral Stavridis, at the same time, President Xi is now on his first visit in 5 years to Europe. And looking to Europe, a huge market for China. Macron and the rest of the leaders there, the EU leaders, want that Chinese commerce, but at the same time, they've got a war in Europe. And they see also China's support for Vladimir Putin as being, a game changer, right?
Indeed. And in the course of this visit, Xi is very strategically going after France, which occasionally has tendencies to stand a bit aside or a bit outside of the alliance. President Macron several years ago famously said NATO is brain dead. That was before the invasion of Ukraine. But Xi will go and see Macron. Then he'll kind of go to someone outside the alliance, Serbia, led by a man named Vučić, who is very closely aligned with Russia. And then he'll go to Hungary, to Budapest, to the NATO member who is the closest to Russia. So to Dmitry's point of how is China playing this, they are trying to draw closer and closer to Russia. They don't want to trigger sanctions. That's why they're providing, kind of dual-use components. I don't think that's fooling many people. It's going to be a real increasing state of tension between the U.S. and China going forward, especially in this election year.
So clearly, we live in interesting times, and we will probably be living in interesting times for the next 4 to 5 years. unfortunately. Of course, in many ways, the analyst had mentioned that foreign investment was down 20% year over year, and that is partly because China, under Xi Jinping, is acting like a reckless, spoiled child who doesn't listen to his parents. They've been doing these crazy military maneuvers all around Taiwan the past 6 to 9 months. They flew a spy balloon over the United States. Their Coast Guard is firing water cannons and injuring sailors who are in the Philippines, which, by the way, is a treaty nation with the United States. They've also been cracking down in Hong Kong, which hasn't made the news for a while, but a year or two ago, that was big news. And so when a government such as China acts that way, when they crack down on citizens and companies, when you do these kinds of things, then, well, yes, of course, Western and U.S. companies are not going to want to invest or expand in your country. So this is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. In a moment, I'm going to share 2 ways this is already starting to backfire against China. But before I do, I want to mention, in the episode notes is an incredible map. It's one of the best I've seen. So that's why I wanted to share it with you guys. That really does a good job of showing you exactly where China is compared to Taiwan, compared to the Philippines, compared to South Korea and Japan. And it'll give you a good understanding of just how close these countries are. And it's funny because when I've looked at maps of Japan to China, as you know, Japan is building up its military, it seems so far away. But when you look at this map and you see the distance from China to the Philippines and you compare it to China to Japan, you realize that Japan is about the same distance as the Philippines is. And so there are a lot of countries, including Vietnam, that have a lot of interest in working together against China because China is acting like such a bully in the Pacific. Now, I mentioned earlier I was going to discuss 2 ways this is affecting China. But glancing at my notes, there's really 3. And these are 3 things that have all happened within the past week or 2. I'm not going to talk about how Japan is rapidly expanding its budget, or how all of these countries are creating increasingly organized alliances to operate together as naval powers to counter China. There's so many broader points I could make, but I just wanted to point out recent news within the past week or 2-ish on one of them, that the world is quickly coming together, and China's actions as part of the self-fulfilling prophecy are starting to create reactions from other countries throughout the world. The first one is that Australia has announced that they are going to increase the size of their defense budget. Now, it was already going to go up some, but they announced they're dropping another 50 billion Australia dollars, which is 32 billion US dollars. So, I mean, this is no small amount of money. You know what size aid package we sent to Ukraine, although technically much of it's staying in the United States, but that was about 60 billion US dollars. Australia is dropping 32 billion US dollars in addition to what it had already planned. So they're taking their defense budget from 2.1% of their GDP, gross domestic product, to 2.4%. So that's a pretty good little rise, especially to be announced in such a short time period. It wasn't like a 10-year plan or anything. This was, hey, we're seeing things happen. We've got to get more serious. And they were already starting to get serious, but they announced we got to get more serious faster. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is the U.S. Navy announced that it had sent another destroyer through the Taiwan Strait. This was the USS Halsey. It literally went through, or is going through, as we speak, basically, There's a photo from May 8th, which is Wednesday when I'm recording this. But what's interesting about that is this is the third time that we've sent U.S. naval ships through that strait this year. It's starting to speed up how often we're sending them through. But the U.S. is making very clear that this isn't just aimed at Taiwan. And I like how they word this. The Navy says the ships transited through a corridor in the strait that is beyond the territorial sea of any coastal state. The Halsey, which is called the USS Halsey, Halsey's transit through the Taiwan Strait demonstrates the United States' commitment to upholding freedom of navigation for all nations as a principle. No member of the international community should be intimidated or coerced into giving up their rights and freedoms. So I like how they said that. It's kind of like a reminder to everyone that no one's going to get by with this. We're stopping these 100 plus years of countries pushing other countries around. It's like, no, everyone, the lines are drawn. Everyone's got to hold up. And so I know some people scoff at it and call it, the new international order or whatever they want to call it. But the reality is we've spent a couple hundred years seeing what happens when countries just invade and attack and defend. And so there are a lot of countries, including the U.S., but a lot of countries in Europe and the West that want to just remind China that we've had a good run of several decades of peace, and expansionist ideas are not in anyone's interest. So the U.S. Navy just did a nice show of force. The third thing I want to mention is actually the biggest one of all. It has now been acknowledged by Taiwan that the U.S. has responded, probably to the balloon incident and some of the other aggressive actions by China, because this goes back to about March, so we're a couple of months back. But Taiwan acknowledged the presence of U.S. Army Special Forces on some islands that U.S. forces have never deployed to. Special forces deployed to a tiny island that's held by Taiwan that is 3 miles from China. We sent troops 3 miles from China. This breaks a 70-year precedent. 70 years. This hadn't been done in 70 years. And it's interesting because sometimes I am as hard on President Biden as anyone else, because it often appears that he could stand stronger. And that's a talking point on the right. But I'm telling you, putting U.S. troops 3 miles from China and breaking a 70-year precedent is pretty gutsy. I don't care whether you're left or right or whatever. That even makes me a little nervous. Maybe I'm getting a little old or something, but when you start breaking precedents like that, that's a pretty big deal. So I'll put lots of links into the story because I had to make sure that this was nailed down, but it's been written about in the Wall Street Journal. The Hoover Institute's talked about it. It was reported on in Newsweek and several other places, including the Hudson Institute. So it was also in the Telegraph. It was in Asian Times. This is like pretty well nailed down, and that's a pretty big deal. So as China is acting the way it is, they are starting to encounter increasing resistance. And also, when things like this happen in places like China, where they try to control the media, they try to control the narrative, well, their aggression has led to U.S. troops being placed 3 miles from their homeland. 3 miles. I mean, that's nothing. There are so many weapon systems that can hit that It's unbelievable, really. So 3 miles from there. Now, the U.S. Department of Defense says it is not a permanent assignment, but still, it is a shot across the bow, I would say. What are your thoughts? Do you agree with that? If you disagree, I want to know, but that is a pretty bold move. That's how I see it. And I don't think I'm alone, because the Hudson Institute called it a monumental shift in U.S. military and foreign policy posture. Okay, so let's move from China to a story that I really don't even want to cover, and I want to cover this as delicately as possible, but as you probably heard in the news, a U.S. soldier has been detained inside of Russia. So how did this happen? The Washington Post and many other media outlets are saying that Army Staff Sergeant Gordon Black, who is 34, met a Russian woman while stationed in South Korea, and then he followed her to Russia without notifying his commanders. You can see lots of video of him with this girlfriend. Apparently, Black is currently married but going through a divorce, and so he had met this girl from Russia, had a girlfriend. They had broken up. She had returned to Russia, and he went there to try to get her back. He was on leave and was supposed to be returning to a army base in Texas, but instead he traveled to Russia to try to get his girlfriend back, and he was arrested there. The military says he was not authorized to travel to Russia, nor did he ask permission. As you guys can probably guess, social media has been brutal, making fun of him for falling for this. But, I mean, on the one hand, I get it. You are often warned by the military to be cautious of women who are attracted to you. I know they used to tell us every time we were overseas, whether it was in various countries in Europe, when I was doing a Mediterranean float, what we call a med float, or when I was in Okinawa or South Korea, no matter which platoon sergeant I had at the time, they would always say, hey guys, none of y'all are good looking. If an attractive woman comes up and starts flirting with you or talking with you or any of that, half of you guys couldn't even get girlfriends in high school. So you should know they are interested in one thing, and it's not whether you are attractive or not. They are interested in you because you are military, and because they are trying to get information on either your unit or on you or something they should not have. Therefore, you should be very cautious. And so you'll see lots of comments on social media really that are just brutal. But I just want to say that, no question, he's made a horrific mistake, and it's going to hit him soon if it hasn't already. But without question, he's in deep trouble now. He will be if he's ever returned to the U.S. with his own command and with the military. But the reality is at some point, it's going to hit him that he has made this unbelievably big mistake, and he's going to be scared and isolated. And, I know it's a tough message to deliver, but he is going to be deserving of our love and forgiveness. And so I just want to ask people to try to be kind. We all make mistakes, and the reality is this is an American soldier who is now inside Russia, inside a Russian jail, which is probably the last place any of us want to be. So let's just think about that and try to be kind. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, there's still going to be a lot. We're going to cover some Ukraine news. We're going to cover some U.S. history, actually. I bet there's a incident that involved the loss of 176 sailors that happened in the 50s during peacetime that you probably don't know about. I'm going to briefly cover that. And then we'll also have our segment on motivation and honoring Medal of Honor recipients. So lots of good stuff to come if you'll hang with me. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. If you haven't figured out the format of the show or what I'm about, let me just briefly explain it. Every week I do 3 things. First, I cover defense news and hot spots happening around the world that could affect our country. Secondly, I work to unite the nation and make you feel better and more optimistic about the country's future. And then finally, at the end of each episode, I share some motivation and inspiration because we all can use a little of that. I also, during that section of the show, recognize a Medal of Honor recipient. If you enjoyed the show, you can help support it. As you know, we have no sponsors or commercials, but for $5 per month, you can help me grow this into something bigger. I will be completely honest and transparent here. I work a full-time job that I actually do enjoy, but I feel almost compelled to do this. I feel like we need to unify this country. I feel like there are people that need some optimism, some motivation, some inspiration. And honestly, I feel like there are some people who need God. I don't want to push that too much, but I also don't want to shy away from that. The honest truth is, when I'm not working or spending time with my family, I feel drawn to do this. I would love in a perfect world to devote myself to this full time, but there's absolutely no pressure. I'm going to continue doing this whether there are a ton of supporters or not, just in my free time. So if you would like to grow this into something better, if you would like to support, if you think what I'm doing is important, you would like to see this effort flourish, then definitely sign up. I know that I could make these better with more time and with better quality and more preparation. Perhaps I can reach more people. So there you have it. We are in a public square. I am performing as best I can with the instrument that I have and with the amount of time that I've been able to devote to this. And there is a bucket sitting in front of me. If you want to throw a few dollars in, that would be awesome. If you don't, I will be here next week performing again. All the details for how to do this are in the episode notes on my Substack page, or you can also do so through Patreon. Let's move to some news about Russia. As you probably did not hear because it really didn't make the news, but Vladimir Putin was inaugurated this past week for his 5th term as Russian president. Of course, he was elected as part of a rigged election, and including arresting opponents. But out of fairness to him, I will read the quotes he had to say, since he did talk about the West. Here's what Vladimir Putin had to say. Okay, so I lied. I'm not going to read it because his comments are so absurd, so false, and just so inflammatory. I'm just not going to read them because if you heard them, you might say, well, maybe we should just negotiate with him. But this is a man who invades countries, bombs cities with civilian targets, bombs infrastructure, has his military abduct kids to be re-educated, allows his soldiers with no punishment to rape women and torture prisoners, and so I'm not reading his statement at all. Now, if you have any issues with this, you can talk to my management team, which, oh, that's right, I don't have a management team. See, this is great. This is why it's great not to work for corporate media, because I can set the rules. But if you want to send me a long email, you can send it. I will probably scan it and promptly delete it, because I feel pretty strongly about this. I do need to move from here to one bit of late-breaking news involving the House. This is political news in the U.S., so I'm talking about the House of Representatives, and I'm covering this because it's hopefully a sign of some good news to come. As you will have heard by tomorrow, Marjorie Taylor Greene called the vote to try to oust and remove Speaker Mike Johnson, a fellow Republican. So she called the vote on that. Has been talking about doing that for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks because of Ukraine and whatever reasons she has. Interestingly, she was smacked down hard. So on the vote, 11 Republicans supported the move, while 196 Republicans voted to keep Johnson in the speaker's slot. Joining him was a ton of Democrats, 163 that voted to keep him there, 32 against. So the overall vote was 359 to 43, with 7 Democratic lawmakers voting present. So 359 to 43, a loud, resounding vote of support for Speaker Mike Johnson. And he said after that vote that he appreciated the overwhelming show of confidence to, quote, defeat this misguided effort. He added, hopefully this is the end of the personality politics and the frivolous character assassination that has defined the 118th Congress. It's regrettable. It's not who we are as Americans, and we're better than this. We need to get beyond it. Well, I completely agree with that statement for sure. So I'm hoping that the smackdown that she endured is a lesson. And I'm not just totally putting this on her. I don't like extremists on either wing of either party. I know sometimes you have to have folks who advance certain things by being an outlier or being way out of the norm. And certainly she's one of those for the Republicans. I could name some for the Democrats. But there has been too much of that and not enough getting done. And politics is about compromise and getting as much as you can, but ultimately moving the ball forward some on whatever issue you care about. And you don't always get what you want. So if this is a step toward more normalization and having these extremists on both sides finally put in their place, then I am all for it. So I'm counting this as good news. And while you or myself or whomever may not be the biggest fan of Speaker Mike Johnson, it probably would not have been good for our country to have endured probably 2 to 3 weeks or so of votes trying to find another speaker. As a reminder, the House of Representatives right now is almost exactly split, dead even. I think Republicans currently have a 1-vote margin. So it would have been a ugly speaker race to try to find a replacement for him. So we'll keep him there and hopefully get a little bit more done before politics and the upcoming election just grinds everything to a total halt. Let's move from U.S. news to a couple of Ukraine stories. Maybe 3 actually, but the first one is Ukraine has announced that it arrested 2 colonels. Now, colonel's a pretty high rank. That's just below general. 2 colonels who were part of a plot to kill President Zelensky. I've got a little bit on this in the episode notes, but essentially these folks were recruited by the Russians' security service, the FSB, which is kind of what the KGB used to be before they rebranded it. But they recruited these 2 gentlemen. Again, these were high-ranking officers, colonels, and they were in the security element that was in the agency responsible for protecting senior government leaders. So, not sure how close they got, but that is really high up. And so these 2 folks were arrested. They had planned to assassinate him as a gift to Russia as a part of Vladimir Putin's inauguration, which I just mentioned a few minutes ago. But thank goodness these individuals, assuming they were guilty, were stopped. I'm sure they will be charged and face trial now. But assuming they are guilty as is alleged, they will get their day in court. But I'm glad they were stopped for sure. And I should say that for the moment at least, they have not been named and their faces were blacked out in photos. Now, I have two more Ukraine news stories that are not that great, unfortunately. First one is that Ukraine has ordered a nationwide electricity rationing situation after Russia launched just a brutal bombing campaign on Tuesday and unfortunately knocked out some power plants and part of the electrical grid. And so unfortunately this is partly from the delay from the U.S. not getting aid there in time, but for the moment there will be nationwide rationing. They're going to evenly distribute the rationing, and it will typically have some blackouts or brownouts from between 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. according to the state energy provider. So I'm really hoping that we get more air defense there soon. And there are even some additional European countries that are talking about sending Patriot units and other air defense because it is very clear that Ukraine needs more to protect its electrical grid before a much worse catastrophe unfolds. In other not-so-great news for Ukraine, Russia has announced and shown video of a train system that is now in place inside occupied Ukraine, it basically circumvents the entire Russian territory. So they'll be able to move logistics and all much easier other than just using the bridge across the Black Sea into Crimea. They will now have a train. Of course, trains are how Russia mostly uses, or is mostly used by Russia to move its logistics. So this is not great news for Ukraine, that Russia will now be able to more easily move ammunition, vehicles, troops, etc. I'm sure this train system that set up these tracks will be a target, but they'll be pretty easily to be replaced, and it's a very long target. So this is not the best news for Ukraine, for sure. One other news story I want to mention before we do a brief thing on some history and then get to the motivation and the Medal of Honor stuff is I'm putting in the episode notes a thread that if you want to read, there have been some serious protests and some unrest in Georgia, which is obviously a country in Europe. I'm not talking about the southern United States, but there have been some pretty ugly and massive protests in Georgia as their government is basically leaning toward Russia, and a lot of the people want to be toward Europe and toward the West and toward the EU. The same thing happened in Ukraine during the protests back in, I believe it was 2014 or 2012, the Maidan protest that turned into basically civil war and eventually led to Russia invading. The same thing is kind of starting to brew inside Georgia as the government is increasingly leaning toward Moscow and Putin, and the people do not want it. And as they pass more aggressive laws that they're really quite frightening if you live there, the people are not happy about it. So I've got a thread in the episode notes. I don't have time to get into it tonight, but they're increasingly turning ugly, what's happening there. So something to keep your eye on or your ear toward, or you can go read a little bit more about it. I've got the link again in the episode notes. Okay, I want to try something new this week that I think I'm going to do from here on out, which is every week I'm going to try to share some U.S. history you've probably never heard of or that most people have forgotten. And this week I wanted to talk about, there was a U.S. ship crash that you have probably never heard of. And in 1952, during peacetime, the USS Wasp collided with, which was of course an aircraft carrier, collided with a destroyer while conducting night flying operations. So this huge aircraft carrier, probably moving at pretty good speed, ran into a much smaller destroyer. The carrier lost 75 foot of its front, or its bow, while the destroyer was split in two and went down with 176 men. So just like that, almost 180 men died in what was the greatest loss of life on a Navy ship since World War II. And I'll bet you had never heard of this. Again, this was the USS Wasp, an aircraft carrier, collided with a destroyer, cut it in half, 180 men gone. Greatest loss of life on a Navy ship since World War II. And I'm bringing this up partly because I just want us to remember the unbelievable sacrifice of so many men and women who have served this country that we just have forgotten about or take for granted these days. One crazy footnote, and of course you can go to the episode notes to see what this carrier looked like when it's missing 75 feet of the bow, the part that's in the water. I don't even know. I'm sure they sealed off the parts in front of that, but I don't even know how it didn't take just a ton of water in. But the U.S. Navy actually repaired that in a New Jersey shipyard in a record 10 days. They took another bow section from her sister ship, the USS Hornet, and fixed it in 10 days. Do you think that would happen today? I don't think so, but I mean, that is just impressive. But wow, what a loss of life. And they were transiting toward the Mediterranean. Peacetime, like I said, just a horrible, horrible tragedy that happened during training. All right, let's get to the best part of the show. I call this the Never Ever Give Up segment. And I call it the Never Ever Give Up segment because we must never ever give up as a country. Though we face great division, a massive debt burden, and probably future problems that none of us could even predict. But we must never give up as a country. And I believe we must stay united. And also as individuals, we must never ever give up. We've got family and friends counting on us. So in this section, I'm going to share some motivation to help encourage you. I'd like to begin by honoring a Medal of Honor recipient. If you don't know, the Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration you can possibly earn in the military, and it's awarded to service members who have distinguished themselves by acts of valor. The medal is typically awarded by the President of the United States upon the recommendation of the armed services. One final footnote before I read this week's. As I said when I first began this back in April, I am just going in alphabetical order because I could not possibly decide which wars to begin with, which services, etc. And since there's more than 3,000 of these, it was just too much. So I'm just going very simplistic alphabetical order. As a reminder, last week we honored Benny Adkins. He was a sergeant first class who served in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. And moving along from there in alphabetical order, the first one I want to do this week is Joseph Atkinson. He served in World War I in the U.S. Army, and where this was an earlier citation in our military history, it's a very brief one. It's about one paragraph, but I will read that now. Sergeant Joseph Atkinson was involved in an attack by his unit. I'm quoting now. When murderous machine gun fire at a range of 50 yards made it impossible for his platoon to advance and had caused the platoon to take cover, Sergeant Atkinson, acting alone with the greatest amount of courage, rushed across 50 yards of open ground directly into the face of the hostile machine gun. He kicked the gun from the parapet, which is a trench. Again, he kicked the gun from the trench into the enemy's defensive fortifications. And at the point of the bayonet from his rifle, Sergeant Atkinson captured the 3 men manning the gun. The courage and quick decision of this soldier enabled the platoon to resume its advance. Wow, that's pretty crazy there, is it not? Running forward at a machine gun. And if you recall from your history, these machine guns were usually aligned atop like a piece of wood with a couple of, stops on the left and right. So you would slide these machine guns from left to right if you were the enemy and literally mow men down as they attacked across these trenches and across the open fields. And so that's pretty incredible that he charged directly into it. I'm assuming he probably was, zigzagging to survive it, but then kicked it and then jumped into the trench with a bayonet and captured 3 men. Pretty incredible stuff. So the first one, again, was Sergeant Joseph Atkinson. I'm going to do 2 more because they're both short this week. The next gentleman I want to honor is Corporal Harry Adriance. He served in the Boxer Rebellion. Again, that was in the early 1900s when there was some pretty serious fighting. This is one of those situations where it's literally just one sentence, but the citation reads, "In the presence of the enemy during the battle near Tientsin, China, July 13th, 1900, Corporal Adriance distinguished himself by meritorious conduct." And that is probably the greatest understatement of the century, but back then and on some of the older citations, they say very little, but you can be confident that much was done by that individual. And let's do one final one. This one's from World War II. Gentleman is Private First Class Harold Agerholm. We'll read his citation. "For conspicuous gallantry and courage at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty while serving with the 4th Battalion, 10th Marine Regiment, 2nd Marine Division, in action against enemy Japanese forces on Saipan in the Marianas Islands on July 7th, 1944. When the enemy launched a fierce, determined counterattack against our positions and overran a neighboring artillery battalion, PFC Agerholm immediately volunteered to assist in the efforts to check the hostile attack and evacuate our wounded. Locating and appropriating an abandoned ambulance jeep, he repeatedly made extremely perilous trips under heavy rifle and mortar fire, and single-handedly loaded and evacuated approximately 45 casualties, working tirelessly and with utter disregard for his own safety during a grueling period of more than 3 hours. During intense, persistent enemy fire, he ran out to aid 2 men whom he believed to be wounded Marines, but in the process was himself mortally wounded by a Japanese sniper while carrying out this hazardous mission. PFC Agerholm's brilliant initiative, great personal valor, and self-sacrificing efforts in the face of almost certain death reflect the highest credit upon himself and the U.S. Naval Service. He gallantly gave his life for his country. Wow, that is just something else. 3+ hours of running around under heavy fire to save 45 casualties. Now, probably not every one of those 45 lived, but just to save, who knows, dozens of men who probably did live, and to inspire those around him, and to risk such danger, and to ultimately give his life. That is just something else. Again, that was Private First Class. This wasn't a corporal or a sergeant. This was a Private First Class Harold Agerholm. What a man. As I say every week, I share these Medal of Honor stories to remind us of the sacrifices that have been made through the nearly 250 years of American history. Through so many major wars, more than 1 million Americans have sacrificed their lives and died, getting us to this time and place in our history. In wars such as the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, then following September 11th, Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and these were only the major wars that I've listed, and I know I overlooked so many smaller conflicts. In all, more than 41 million Americans have served over the course of our nation's history. And as I said earlier, more than 1 million have died. Tens of millions have been wounded or had their lives shattered. So I think it's always important that we remember these facts, particularly when we have people regularly saying that we face a potential civil war, or that we should split up our country because of whatever the latest culture war is, or any other number of silly reasons. I think our grandparents and our great-grandparents and those who came before them would be dumbfounded to think we could rip apart this great nation over such trifling issues. Now, let's share some motivation to make sure that we never, ever give up in our own personal lives. And, of course, if you're a regular listener, I also speak about never giving up when I discuss PTSD at the end of the show. But for now, let's just talk about some motivation, and we've got some great ones this week. This first one is a quote from Muhammad Ali. Of course, he's the famous boxer. The quote is, "You're not going to enjoy every minute of the journey, but the success you'll find at the end will make it all worthwhile." Again, you're not going to enjoy every minute of the journey, but the success you'll find at the end will make it all worthwhile. Here's the next one. Don't worry about those who talk behind your back. They're behind you for a reason. That's a good one. Don't worry about those who talk behind your back. They're behind you for a reason. Here's the next one. Today's a good day to have a great day. Such a simple concept that sometimes you got to just tell yourself, today's a good day to have a great day. Here's the next one. It's time to stop wishing and start working. Again, it's time to stop wishing and start working. This next one is a quote from the famous soccer player Pelé. Success is no accident. It is hard work, perseverance, learning, studying, sacrifice, and most of all, love of what you are doing or learning to do. Again, success is no accident. What is necessary for success? This is what he says. It is hard work, perseverance, that's never quitting, right? Learning, getting better, right? Studying, how do you get even better? You study. Sacrifice, and most of all, love of what you are doing or learning to do. If you don't love it, you will not make it. You will quit. All right, here's the next one. You are only as successful as your mindset. Think bigger. Again, you are only as successful as your mindset. Think bigger. It's funny, I have literally the word think bigger written in a massive magic marker across a full 8.5 by 11 sheet. It's been there for about a year now, and it's above some postcards from Chicago, because when I traveled to Chicago, I guess a couple of years or so ago, about 2 years I think, it just blew me away with how much bigger everything was in Chicago. And of course, I'm from the South, from Knoxville, and I haven't been to a lot of big cities, and it just reminded me that I have to think bigger as far as the audience, etc. But in your own life, you got to do the same thing. We all get stuck in our own little ruts, in our own little towns or cities, and we don't think big enough. Again, you are only as successful as your mindset. Think bigger. Here's the next one. When the journey ahead overwhelms you, remember, all you have to do today is take one small step forward. Again, when the journey ahead overwhelms you, remember, all you have to do today is take one small step forward. This is just such an important lesson, and it affects all of us. Our projects are too big, the deadlines are approaching, etc., and you almost just lock up and you can't do anything. And, I remember I've read so many Navy SEAL books, and one of the things they teach the SEALs to get through Hell Week is if you look at the entire process of how long it's going to take to be a Navy SEAL, it's too overwhelming. Just the initial training is like 9 months or something crazy. It's like 2 years before you're really going to make a team. And for most, folks going through that training, as you're dealing with the sand and the surf and the freezing water and the lack of sleep, it's just, you're like, I can't even make it through today. I can't even think about 9 months or longer or 2 years. And so they teach them, just break it down into, hour segments. Make it to lunch an hour. Make it 5 minutes. Just make it through that training scenario. If you do it that way, you got a much better chance of actually getting to the end and not quitting. Okay, we're going to do one more. This is a quote from Thomas Edison, obviously a famous inventor and American. Here's the quote. Our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to succeed is always to try just one more time. Again, our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to succeed is always to try just one more time. And of course, there's the famous story that he failed 10,000 times when trying to invent the light bulb, but he never gave up, and that's why we remember his name today. All right, moving along. As you guys know, I always like to share a few from the Bible just because this book has become such a source of strength and wisdom and calm for me during the past year. And I hope by sharing a few, it might help encourage you to get into the Bible yourself, because I think it'll really help you. And yes, I used to be just like some of you people out there who thought the Bible was a waste of time, we'll say. I almost said the word joke, but there were times where I scoffed at the Bible myself. But man, there's so much good stuff in it. All right, this week I'm just going to read a very short verse from chapter 1 of Psalms. I said verse, I meant chapter, but it's a very short chapter, so I'm just going to read it. Again, this is Psalms chapter 1. Oh, the joys of those who do not follow the advice of the wicked. Do not follow the advice of the wicked, or stand around with sinners, or join in with mockers. But they delight in the law of the Lord, meditating on it day and night. They are like trees planted along the riverbank, bearing fruit each season. Their leaves never wither, and they prosper in all they do. But not the wicked. They are worthless chaff, scattered by the wind. They will be condemned at the time of judgment. Sinners will have no place among the godly, for the Lord watches over the path of the godly, but the path of the wicked leads to destruction. Again, that is chapter 1 of Psalms. It's got some, what I would call some carrot and stick in it, right? There are some reasons to obey the Lord, and there are some warnings for those who do not. And so, like much of the Bible, it reminds us that that little conscience that we often ignore, we probably should not be ignoring, because falling short and sinning leads to death according to the Bible. And it certainly leads to death in our lives, whether it's not working hard at work and not getting a promotion, or maybe losing your job, or not spending the right amount of time with your spouse or your family, and that leads to separation or distance. The reality is we all like to be fluffy and talk in light and positive ways, but the reality is when you're not doing the right thing, there will be consequences that follow, both in this life and the next. And I know that's a little tougher message than I normally deliver, but don't get mad at me if you got a problem with those words. You can bring that up to God, because they're pretty much all straight out of the Bible. So don't shoot the messenger, right? Thanks so much for joining us this week. I hope as you go through this week that you act a little nicer on social media and in the world as well. Smile at folks in the grocery store, do small acts of kindness, and remember that most Americans are good, and they will help you in an emergency, even if you don't agree politically. Now, I have to finish with two things. I want to say a bit about myself and my books in case you're new to the show, and then I need to say some words for those struggling with PTSD or mental illness, especially since veterans are at a 57% higher risk of suicide. First, a bit about myself and my books. I am a military vet. I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps, all of that time in the infantry, and yes, that does matter. After my enlistment, I went to college at the University of Tennessee. I became a journalist. I spent more than 10 years in the news business. Besides all of that, I've also written 12 books. Those books include a series about a Marine Corps sniper, several novels about a police detective and a private investigator, and a few books about war, such as World War II and Afghanistan. Basically, these are all fast-moving books with lots of action and plot twists, because those are the kind of books I've always enjoyed reading. You can find all of those books in the link in the episode notes, or you can look on Amazon by just searching my name, Stan R. Mitchell. Buying a book, telling a friend about a book, or buying one as a gift for someone, friend or loved one, is a great way to help support the show. And in all seriousness, they're pretty highly rated, and I've been very fortunate to have sold 70,000 copies to date. And I promise you, even though I live in Tennessee, I do not have that many cousins. The second thing I need to talk about is PTSD and suicide for just a moment. This isn't just for our veterans, although I know PTSD does seem to affect veterans at a much higher rate, but it's for anyone. We can all get in a really low spot, but we have to remember that it's a season. It's a valley. If you're having serious issues, please call 988, select 1. You can talk to a crisis line responder anytime, day or night. Whether you're a civilian or a veteran, it doesn't matter. But I do know this is hard to do, and I know most of you won't, so I have to be a little mean here. The fact is that when we had a drill instructor in boot camp pushing us, or maybe a tough coach back in high school, you know that you can go further than when it's just yourself pushing you. So I'm going to be that person. I'm going to be mean for just a moment, and I have to remind you that you cannot give up. Do not lose this fight. Do not make your parents or your family have to plan your funeral. Don't make them feel guilty that they did not check on you, that they could not reach you. You can hold on another day, and if you do, I promise the next day will be a little easier. Now, again, if you're in a fight that you worry you may lose, call someone. Call a friend or a family member. Please, just do that. Or call 988, select 1. But whatever you do, do not quit. You're in a valley, and this world needs you. Probably your parents need you. I mean, seriously, who's going to take care of your parents in 30 years? I'm being dead serious here. I just helped take care of my mom while she fought with cancer before she passed. I'm helping take care of my dad now. But who's going to do it for you? Are you going to let the system take care of them? How horrible is that? So you cannot quit. And believe me, there's something you're meant to do. You just can't see it because you're in this immediate fog and pain. You can't see that end result. But there's a mission for you to do. Maybe it's to coach Little League. Maybe it's to help others with PTSD. Maybe it's to run for office. But there's some calling for you. You just haven't found it. But you need to get involved. You need to stop isolating yourself. Go visit a veterans group, the VFW. Visit a church near you. Talk to some family that you have lost touch with. Or maybe reach out to that friend that you've grown apart from. They're probably dying to talk to you. But seriously, if you're struggling, call the hotline 988 and select 1. Or you can also start moving toward God. If you're not willing to make that phone call, read the Bible if you never have. I think it will help. Read some of Psalms or Proverbs, or start with the New Testament, maybe Luke. I think you'll find that the Bible will start drawing you in and changing your life. If you don't have a Bible, you can download a Bible app on your phone, or you can look it up online. There are dozens of sites with it. Even simpler, I have a link in the episode notes that I think can help you. I write a faith-based blog about the Bible and God, and I have a link in my episode notes to a pretty powerful story about my dog, who is a stray that we adopted from the shelter. The title of the article is Be Like Ozzy, Go Near Your Master. I've had a lot of people tell me that story really helped move them, that it was very impactful. So, it's free to read. You got nothing to lose by going to read it. Now, I always like to end each show by reminding people that you can comment anytime. I try to monitor those. You can also reach out privately by email to me at authorstanrmitchell@yahoo.com. And that's in the episode notes, by the way. But again, it's authorstanrmitchell@yahoo.com. Hey, here's one other thing. This podcast is about defense news, but I also do a political blog. So if you love my moderate, optimistic views, you might enjoy that. It's called Thoughts from a Southern Gentleman. You can find a link to the episode notes to that as well, or you can just search that on Google. Hey, thanks for hanging with me this week. It's truly an honor to talk with each of you, and to know that there's a few of you out there who are listening and who care about our country and our military and all the issues that we face. I know there are a lot of scary issues out there, but we're going to get through them together, the same way America's gotten through everything before this. I love you all, but never forget that God loves you more than you can possibly imagine. He is our true Father, so I hope you spend some time with Him this week. If you want true peace and strength and wisdom, make sure you read your Bible some this week. It'll help you a lot. And also, reach out to a friend or anyone who you know is struggling. Whether they are young or old, life is truly hard. We know this. But the true strength of this country is its people, and that includes you folks listening to me right now. So be a leader, be a doer, be a servant to someone. With all of that being said, I'll catch you all next week. You have been listening to The View from the Front. I hope you enjoyed the show.